Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's colloquium, the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. My name is Nadia Ali, and I'm the current director of the Center for Middle East Studies, also professor of anthropology and Middle East Studies here. And it's my great pleasure to host today's event, which is co-sponsored by the William Rhodes Center that focuses on international economics and finance and is directed by my colleague, Professor Mark Blythe. So I would like to start out by introducing our speaker today, which is of course also my colleague here at Brown, Professor Sreemati Mitter. Sreemati is a Qutayba Al-Ghanim Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern History and International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She is also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Toulouse, France. Her work examines the economic dimensions of statelessness. She received her PhD and master's in history from Harvard University, a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School, and a BA in economics from Middlebury College. Sreemati previously worked for the Palestine Investment Fund in Ramallah, in Palestinian territories, and at Credit Suisse in New York for the Energy and Project Finance Group and its investment banking division. Currently, she is completing her first book, A History of Money in Palestine from the 1900s to the present. And I'm also really happy that we'll be joined. So what is going to happen is that Sreemati will talk for about 25 minutes. And then we are joined by one of her interlocutors, Karim Shadid, who is going to talk for a few minutes. And he is the grandson of the Palestinian refugee whose story Sreemati will tell. Following that, there will be time for discussion, and you have two options: either use the chat function and write down your question or your comment, or use the raised hands function. Okay, so welcome Sreemati, and we're very happy and very excited to listen to you and your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia. Really a special thanks to you, and also special thanks to Barbara, who has organized this talk and, who has really been a paragon of virtue and patience, because this talk was originally supposed to happen back in those before days, pre-COVID. And then it just kept getting canceled and postponed, and she's been so patient in trying to find a date that works. So I'm really grateful to Barbara and also to Nadia for giving me this opportunity. And it's really, really exciting to be able to talk about this. And I'm very, very excited. I'm always excited to talk about my work, probably too excited. But I'm particularly excited because Karim, who you've all just met briefly, is going to join us today. And as you'll find out, people like Karim are really the main sources of the kind of history I try to do, which is a financial history, but from a bottom-up perspective. So I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to start by telling the story about a man called Victor Wahbe, who is Karim's grandfather. So I'm going to tell you basically a two-part story. And both the parts have to do with these things called the Palestinian bearer bonds. And I'll explain what those are in a bit. But just to keep in mind, this is kind of a two-part story. The first part, which is, if you will, it's the micro story. And that's the story of this man called Victor Wahbe. And here I'm going to share my screen, if I can, and show you a picture of him, because it's always nice to do that. You can decide for yourself whether he looks like Karim or not. Can you all see my screen, Nadia? Yeah. So this is a picture of the person that I'll spend maybe the first 10 minutes of the talk speaking about him and his story. And he is a Palestinian bondholder. And then I'm going to step back and give you a bit of the more macro picture, which is going to talk about the big power politics that are involved in the story as well. So it's a story about Britain, a story about Israel, and it's a story about Jordan. So these are the two elements of the story that I'd like you to sort of keep in mind as I speak. And I'll try to spend roughly half the time on each. So 10 minutes on Victor and 10 minutes on the British, Israeli, Jordanian dimension. So I'll start with Victor, and I'll start on a particular date, which is January 14th, 1948. And we have a barrel bomb that lands. This is a bomb that's launched by Zionist militias on Haddad Street in Haifa, which is in Wadi Nisnas, which is where a lot of Palestinian Arabs live. This is January 1948. The barrel bomb that lands on this street, Haddad Street, destroys 5 houses, and it badly damages a 6th house, which is the house where Victor lives. Victor lives there with his family. Who is Victor? He's about 32 years old at this point in time. He is a Palestinian Christian who happens to work for Barclays Bank. So the picture I showed you briefly was actually his employee card. So he is a Palestinian employee of this big British bank, which has a branch in Haifa, has branches in Jerusalem, Haifa, Jaffa, and everything. So this barrel bomb that partially damages his house leads to this big moment of, sort of trauma in Victor's life. And he decides that the best thing to do is to send all the women folk in his family for safety to Lebanon. This was a very, very common thing for a lot of the Palestinians living in Haifa at the time. If they could, this is January, so it's still early. They don't know what's coming, but, he sends off his mother, his daughter, and his wife to Lebanon in January. But he, at the same time, doesn't think he's going to leave. And in fact, he's so sure he's going to stay that he approaches his employers, Barclays Bank, and he asks them for a loan of £100 as sort of as part of the perks of being a good employee. And he basically asked for this loan to make repairs on this house that was destroyed by this bomb. So this is important for 2 reasons. It's a small detail, but it sort of shows his relationship with the bank, with his employees, because the bank gave him the money. They gave him it was £100 loan. So this shows that Barclays Bank in Haifa, his bosses, basically liked him enough to give him this loan. And it also shows that his own mentality, right? In January, he's taking a loan to repair his house, which means he plans to stay. This changes in early February when we have another bomb. This time it lands outside Barclays' branch in Haifa, and it partially destroys the branch in Haifa, the bank branch. And this is when Barclays headquarters decides to evacuate its branch and basically moves all its non-essential staff to Cyprus. But Victor is not considered a non-essential staff. He is an essential staff, and these words have particular meaning to all of us these days, who is essential and who's not and who decides this. So Victor has to stay in Haifa while there are bombs falling every night. And Victor sort of is, really traumatized by these 2 bombs that fell, one on his house, one in his place of employment. And on 23rd February, he decides that he's going to flee to Lebanon to join the women folk of his family. So he takes this very dangerous journey by road. He crosses into Lebanon through the Ras al-Aura crossing, which some of you might know if you've been to this part of the world. But again, he has no idea that he's not going to return. He's just going to wait out the worst of it so that he doesn't have to be there when the bombs are falling literally from the sky every day. So that's in February. Does not know then that he'll never get to return to Palestine again. Then what happens very quickly, this is the story of the Nakba, so I won't belabor it. I hope if for those of you who want details, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, not to take too much time. In April, there's basically a lot of fighting in Haifa. This is when Haifa is captured by Zionist militias, mainly of the Haganah. And there's a big operation called Operation Bi'ur Hametz, which is called the Passover cleaning. This is when Haifa basically transfers control. The British are nowhere in the picture. The British are basically sort of busy planning their own sort of ignominious retreat from the Palestine Mandate at this point. This is April. And in May 1948, on 14th May 1948, the Mandate for Palestine terminates. The British leave, out of Haifa in the middle of the night, the glorious British Empire. And this is when the State of Israel announces its independence, May 14, 1948. There are 2 more dates that are important to the story and very important to Victor's story. So in June 20th, 1948, this new government of the State of Israel, which has been in existence for literally about 4 weeks at this point, issues an order to all banks still operating in what became Israeli territory to stop all transactions on all Arab accounts. That's the wording, no further details. Stop all transactions on Arab accounts. That's on June 20th. And then in December 1948, there is this passage of these Israeli emergency regulations passed by Eliezer Kaplan, who is the new Israeli Minister of Finance. And they're called emergency regulations on the property of absentees. And absentees are defined, they don't use the word Arab anymore, the Israeli state. Arab was in June. Now in December, there's this concept of somebody who's an absentee. And this is defined as somebody who left Israel in November 1947, which was the date of the UN partition plan. But this is not something that Victor knows anything about. This, the June order or the December emergency regulations. What is interesting in Victor's story is from the time he reaches Lebanon as a refugee, he keeps sending letters to his employers, his boss in Barclays Bank in Haifa, and he basically keeps saying, well, I'm going to come back, but can you make sure my salary is paid? Because he notices that Barclays stops paying his salary. So he sends letter after letter, basically asking Barclays to pay his salary. And he basically explains his situation. He explains that he had to leave in this traumatic moment, and he insists on his salary. After May 1948, when the mandate for Palestine terminates, he begins to sort of read the writing on the wall, and he realizes, okay, he's not sure what the situation is. Barclays basically terminates his employment at that point. So then his letters change tone, and he's sort of very indignant, and he says, well, okay, if you terminate my employment, you need to give me 1 month's notice. You need to pay me the 2 month salary since February. You need to pay me these 50 days I've accumulated of sick leave. And I have 4 Palestinian bearer bonds in the safety deposit box in Haifa branch, and you need to release them. So these 4 Palestinian bearer bonds form the crux of the story I'm going to tell you. But it's important to note, a few things about these letters that are really important to note is how often he wrote. He wrote painstakingly by hand. He almost sent 1 letter every month. And the reason we know this, they're not in any archive. The reason we know this is because of Karim. Karim, wave out so that everybody can, I hope everyone can see you. So Karim is the reason why Victor's story, his painstaking handwritten letters are, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing them with me and for sharing them with us, because this is the story. It is Karim's story. It's not my story to tell. Okay, so Victor's letters, he sends them month after month, handwritten, painstakingly he delineates point by point, right? What he is owed, his salary, his pension. He talks about the money that he'd been contributing to his pension fund, and these bearer bonds, these 4 bearer bonds, which have a coupon value of £10 each. So it's £40. And the salary he's owed is he was getting about £20 a month. So the salary he's owed is about £40 because he claims 2 months that he's owed. And then he sort of nets all of these amounts against the £100 loan he'd taken, to repair his house. So he's very, very carefully sort of saying, okay, this is what I owe you. This is what you owe me. And he nets it all out. And it's a very modest sum in the end. And he says, this modest sum is what you owe me. Please send it to me and please release my bonds, which are sitting in a safety deposit box, right? The thing to note here, there are lots of things to note here, but one thing I will stress is the modesty of these sums. This is not a rich person's story. It's a salaried person. And these are the person whose stories are sort of paramount in my work. These are not the peasants who make up the majority of the Palestinian population at this time, and also the majority in some ways of the story of the Nakba of 1948, nor are these the elites, the big landowners, the big property. These are modest salaried professionals who are writing, letters asking for their salary of 20 Palestinian pounds. It's not nothing, but it's not a lot. So apart from the modesty of these amounts, apart from the persistence of his letters, apart from the careful way in which he documented everything, he kept copies of all his letters, which is why Karim was able to have them and which is why I'm able to have them. He kept everything. So we never got the responses back from Barclays. Who knows if they ever responded? But he kept copies of everything he said. Apart from that, I'll just stress a few things that come out in the letters, which is the tone. It's really interesting. He always starts with stressing that he's a loyal employee of the bank. He mentions that he's worked for 11 years for the bank. He always mentions that he was a very punctual worker. This is where Victor's story departs entirely from mine, because punctuality is not my strong suit at the best of times. But he always says, I'm a loyal worker. I'm extremely punctual. I've never missed work. He always stresses his confidence in British ideas of justice because he's writing. He's writing to his bosses. These are personal letters, but they're all British people. And he sort of always stresses his own difficult financial circumstances since he's been in Lebanon. And he stresses, I quote here, the great losses that I've suffered in losing my house, all my furniture, all the provisions, all the transport expenses. And he basically says, he admits to really suffering mentally, which is, I think, interesting for that time. And at some point he sends a doctor's note, and the doctor basically says that Victor is, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The medical terminology is different for that time. This is 1948. He said, the doctor says something like, Victor is suffering from nervine depression. This doctor's note is partly something that Victor uses to prove that he should be paid sick leave and not be terminated by Barclays. And the letters, again, are always signed with an assurance of his loyalty to Barclays Bank as an employer, his loyalty to the British Empire, even though the tone does change over time and they get darker. So these letters, to give you a sense of how often he wrote, and Karim can perhaps talk a bit about this when I'll give the floor to Karim at the end. But the tone starts out with all these professions of loyalty and all of that. But he keeps writing to 1954. That's when the paper trail goes dead, and it's 8 years of this writing the letters, trying to get his bonds back, trying to get paid his rightful salary. So the tone gets darker towards the end, and he keeps underlining his rights as an employee, his rights as a bondholder. And this is also something that's really important that I'd like you to hold on to. What I'd like to say here, to step back from Victor's story, is that his story is not unique. It's unique because we have so many documents, because he saved everything. And Karim could get them and give them to me. But what I found when conducting research on my book, working in the British National Archives, is that there were all these letters from Palestinian bondholders, both individuals, and there was a committee of people who call themselves the Committee of Palestinian Bondholders, who were writing letters to the British Foreign Office at exactly the same period, starting in 1948, going all the way until 1954. And this committee of bondholders was writing letters to the British Foreign Office. They wrote to the British ambassador in Lebanon. They wrote to the British Secretary of State for the Colonies. They wrote to the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. They even sent in June 1951 a letter to the British King. And this, the reason I know this is because it's all sitting in British National Archives at Kew. And these letters are very similar to Victor's letters. They always start with these professions of loyalty to the British Empire, this sort of faith in British sense of honor and justice, and this language of rights, not political rights. They're not talking as Palestinian refugees, so it's absolutely clear that's what they are. They're talking in the language of the rights of a bondholder, that we bought this bond. We believed this was a safe investment. And I'll tell you in a bit what these bonds are, but I'm just telling you what their letters say. We believe this was a safe investment, and as a bondholder, we have the right to demand, that we get repaid our bonds. So again, very similar to the kinds of letters that Victor was sending. And they sent so many letters that, in fact, I found a handwritten note from the British legation in Beirut, in Lebanon, to the British Foreign Office, basically saying, these people are pestering me again. They use that word. These bondholders are pestering me. Can we give them some kind of response? Which indicates this pestering. It's an interesting word, right? Because it indicates firstly how often these bondholders are writing, and also what the British attitude to these people were. They're pestering me. And, the British Foreign Office said, we should help our colleagues in the British embassy, the British legation in Lebanon, because they have so many of these letters that they have to respond to. Okay, so now I'm going to step back from the story of Victor and the pestering committee of bondholders and talk a bit about what are these bonds that are at the center of the story. What are these bonds that Victor bought and that these bondholders bought that they're claiming repayment for? Okay, so this is really, really interesting. These are Palestinian government bearer bonds, mandate government bearer bonds that were issued by the mandate government after World War II. So there were 3 bond issues. They started in 1944, went up to 1946. So this is basically like the US Treasury bills. It's kind of like what's happening now with President Biden sort of issuing debt for deficit financing. So the British Mandate government Palestine in the post-war sort of era was issuing these bonds. This is all Keynesian economics. The idea being that you raise loans from the public. This is a nice, safe investment for the public. If you're a Palestinian man, you buy, or a woman, as we'll see, there were Palestinian women who bought these bonds as well. You buy a bond, which is 10 Palestinian pounds, right? And it's going to give you a very safe, very low rate of interest. It's 0.1% a year. And you can trade in that bond at any time. So it becomes like cash, but a safe cash, right? You can trade in that bond for 10 pounds. And you can, if you don't trade it in, you keep accumulating the interest and you get paid a dividend every year. So as I said, the British government, the British Mandate government in Palestine released 3 issues of these bonds, and they were very, very successful in Palestine. There were Palestinians who bought them and Jews who bought them. This is one of the problems. There was no way of knowing who bought them and how it was split. These bond issues were split between the communities. What's important to stress is that this was considered a very safe investment if you're a Palestinian living in Palestine in the 40s, or if you're a Jewish person living in Palestine in the 40s. So all 3 issues were fully subscribed, and the British government in Palestine raised 5.8 million pounds through these bond issues over the course of these 2 years. Now, most of these 5.8 million pounds was then given by the Mandate government to various local municipalities. This is the way it works. So the money was given to, let's say, the Jerusalem municipality to undertake repairs or some sort of, fix the road, some sort of infrastructure project. And this is how the Mandate government paid for these big post-war sort of infrastructure repairs and development of Palestine. But what happens in May 1948 is that the British in Palestine realized that 2.65 million of these bonds had not actually been spent. And they were sitting on the books of the Mandate government. And since the Mandate government no longer exists after May 14, 1948, this 2.65 million pounds is transferred to the British Treasury in London and is now controlled by the Secretary of State for the colonies. So the amount to keep in mind is 2.65 million pounds, of which Karim's grandfather, Victor, owns 40 pounds, right? So it's 2.65 million, total was 5.6 million, but of that 2.65 million is sitting now in London. And this is the money that's at the crux of the story. So it's not a huge amount of money. I can put later, in context what 2.65 million is. It's also important to remember, not all of this 2.65 million is owned by Palestinians. As I said, these bonds were bought by Jewish Palestinians and Arab Palestinians. And it's impossible to know, who had, what amount. But the big question is, what do we do? Who should get this money, right? This 2.65 million. So initially, the British government says that it's not our responsibility. These bonds were not issued by the British government. It was not issued by His Majesty's government. It was issued by the Palestine Mandate government, which is a separate thing. But the Palestine Mandate government doesn't exist anymore. So what do we do? Well, the British said, this is not our responsibility. The transfer of this liability for paying these bondholders out should go to the successors of the British Mandate government. And there are 2 successor states of the British Mandate government, Israel and Jordan. This is really, really key to the central argument I'm going to make for you at the end of this talk. There was no place to say, well, there are Palestinians who didn't get a state. There was no even concept of what do we do about these people. For the British, they said, well, the mandate doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by 2 successor states, Israel and Jordan, and therefore the responsibility for paying out these bondholders goes to Israel and Jordan. And what the British did, in fact, was over a very lengthy series of negotiations, they arranged separately with the Israelis and with the Jordanians in 1951 for these bondholders to be paid out. And essentially what happened is that the British government paid this 2.65 million pounds, almost all of it, to the Israeli government in 1951. The Jordanian government didn't get much because the British had some sort of logic of, well, we don't know how many of the bondholders are in Jordan. So let's say it was a minuscule amount anyway. So for the sake of argument, let's just say this 2.65 million pounds We don't know the actual amount, but these 2.65 million pounds went to the Israeli government. The agreement was that the Israeli government would then take the responsibility of paying out all the bondholders. And the British government said, oh, for those bondholders who are not in Israel, we will take the responsibility for paying them out. Right? That's it. End of story. End of talk. Great, right? Happy story. Everything's tied up, right? All the financial loose ends are paid, and the British and the Israelis, put forth joint announcements in all the newspapers of the day, basically saying, if you're a bondholder, if you bought one of these Palestine government bonds, please come forward. You have to register your bonds. If you're in Israel, go to such and such authority. If you're in Lebanon, go to the Ottoman Bank. If you're in Cairo, go to the Ottoman Bank or go to Barclays Bank and register your bond, and we'll pay you out. End of story. We've done our duty. Look at the British. We're such believers in property rights and all of that. No, in fact, it's not the end of the story, because what happens to people like Victor? He is a refugee living in Lebanon, but his bonds are sitting in a safety deposit box in Haifa. And this is the story for almost every single Palestinian who had bought these bearer bonds and who had become refugees. Who was going to think at that point, when they're all thinking they'll just come back in a few days, of going to the bank and taking out their bearer bonds among, everything. And it wasn't even necessarily in the banks. What I found in a lot of my sources is that people left their bonds in their houses. And they left. They didn't leave. They fled, as refugees did. And what happened is these houses were taken by Zionist settlers. And the Zionist settlers, the new occupants of these houses, they found these bond certificates. And when this announcement was published in the newspapers in 1951, they went and registered these bonds as they're supposed to, but they were not the original owners. So what you have immediately after 1951, when the British think the story is done and they paid out the 2.65 million, end of responsibility and all of that, what you end up happening is all sorts of bonds are registered and paid by the Israeli government, not to the people who actually bought them, not to Victor, not to the Palestinian bondholders. And of course, for all the Palestinians who remain in Israel, who are called absentees, there is no way for them to register their bonds and get paid, because the moment they do so, the money is going to be taken under those emergency proclamations that I alluded to in December, which is basically orders the freezing and the transfer to a custodian of absentee property, any financial asset that belongs to any Palestinian. So basically, if you're a refugee, you can't get the money because you don't have the bonds, and you need the physical bonds to register them. If you are an internal refugee and you're living within Israel, you can't get the money because the moment you register your bonds, it's taken from you. So basically, for all the Palestinian bondholders, and unfortunately, I don't know how many there are, we have no sense of how much money, we're talking about, how much of that 2.65 million pounds is actually owed to the Palestinian bondholders, people like Victor. But what we know for sure is none of them were paid in this sort of agreement between the Israelis and the Jordanians and the British. So I'm going to end the story here and turn it over to Karim to say whatever you'd like to say, Karim. But I just want to leave you, before I do that, with Victor's, I want to quote from one of his letters, because I think it's really, really important to give him, voice. So I'm just going to say here, I have one of his letters right here. Sorry. Okay, I'm quoting. Actually, I'm quoting from a few different letters of his. The question of Palestine was not of my own choosing. It was forced upon every one of us. I never thought of leaving my dear home, nor my nice job with you. He's talking to his Barclays boss. Just think of what happened to us. Is there a greater loss and misfortune? Was it with goodwill that we left Haifa? No. And again, I say, we were forced to do so. So I'm going to leave you with Victor's words, and also with this idea of, the central argument, which I've not actually articulated, and, perhaps it's evident, which is that this loss of property, this personal financial property, is something that hasn't really, been acknowledged as being part of the Nakba, even though we talk about the loss of property a lot. That is the central story of the Palestinian Nakba, but it's a landed property and houses. And here what's interesting is it's financial property, and it's transferable. It should theoretically not be taken in that sense, because it should be, you know, even if they're refugees, even if there's this political problem, they should be able to be paid. So a central argument here is that there's something particular about finance, and there's something particular about the legitimating sort of discourse of the rules of finance, the sort of negotiated settlement, even the fact that the Israeli, you know, the way to seize these bonds, if they're Palestinian-owned bonds, is through a law. This is not a grab. This is not the Bolshevik revolution. So there's a legitimating discourse around finance, around law, that I think is central to the story. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why we don't hear so much about it. And there's total silence in the British archives, in the Israeli archives, and also really, you know, among Palestinians about these kinds of, you know, the bonds. Anyway, so I'll stop here because it is 12:30 and I promised Nadia I wouldn't speak for more than that. And Karim, floor is yours.
Thank you, Sreemati, and really happy to be here and share a few words. I'll pick up from the word you mentioned in the end, which is silence. That's exactly how I grew up around this story. It was complete silence about it in my upbringing and in my family. And I actually never met Victor. He passed away in 1976 at the age of 60, and I was born in the 80s, in the following decade. So I actually never met him. But I was very close to his wife, Yvonne, my grandmother, who was also living in Haifa, and she's the, as you mentioned, she was one of the family members who fled to Lebanon before he finally fled and joined them. And I heard from her stories about Haifa and more on the property side, you know, the lamenting the house that they left, the furniture that they didn't take with them because they thought they're coming back, and all of that aspect. And I only heard about that in her later years, in basically the final years of her life. Even before that, she didn't talk much about it. But what I wanted to make is a couple of comments here. One is about the how these stories and of losses and trauma tend to skip a generation, because really his children, his 4 children, my dad and his siblings, never spoke about it. Until today, I don't think they've uncovered the story fully. I had this curiosity because of everything that I had heard from my grandmother, and the things that she told me were things she never told her children. She said it to her grandchildren. So I went looking, you know, after she passed away, and after years later, when we were clearing some rooms in their house, I came across this box of documents, and in that box, I actually have the folder here. I brought it with me to London because I wanted to digitize everything with the permission of my father and his siblings, because I wanted to digitize everything and make sure, you know, the first thing I did was I'm going to scan all of these documents before any of them get lost. In fact, I scanned them in Beirut before flying to London, and the folder had it just had the box had a folder in it, and the folder had a title on it, and it said Palestine. So I start going through this folder, and I come across this very well archived story, you know, painstakingly archived, even chronologically, which made it very easy for me to follow. And I think, you know, when I shared those, when I reached out to Sreemati and I came across her, you know, trying to Google anyone. Basically, I was trying to Google anyone who's done any work on this topic, especially on the financial property loss side of things. And I came across Sreemati and I connected with you. You know, those documents were very easy to follow because Victor has gone. It was like he had preserved the story, knowing fully that the conclusion from his side was inconclusive. It was, you know, unjust, to use his words, but in the hope that, you know, someone will pick it up. And so I'm just really fascinated by how you know, how much he had gone through the effort of documenting everything, keeping all the letters in that chronology. And then I just wanted to make one quick comment, observation. You would have noted, so he is my paternal grandfather. And, typically in the Levant, at least the last name passes right through the male line. So you might wonder, his name was Victor Wihbe and mine is Karim Jdid. We have different last names. And actually the change in last name is central to this story, which is that when he fled to Lebanon, he still had his employment. He still had the hope of keeping that employment at Barclays. His hope was so strong that he will one day go back to Haifa, go back to working for Barclays, that when he took on a job in Tripoli in Lebanon with the Iraqi Petroleum Company, another British institution, he changed his last name because he didn't want that to be used against him if he ever goes back to his Barclays employment. And so he changed his last name from Wihbe to Jdid. And something so central to my identity, my last name, is linked to this story. And I only discovered it a couple of months ago. So I'll leave it here.
Well, thank you very much, Karim and Sreemati. I mean, I have to say that for me, this is history at its best. I mean, as an anthropologist, and I am very much interested in oral histories, and I think what you do, and I'm not surprised that students love your classes because you're clearly an amazing storyteller. But what you do is, you focus, zoom in on the life of particular person, and hereby really contribute to what we are trying to do at Brown. And this is really thanks to Bishara, this sort of vision that we do Palestinian studies, right? And yes, of course, the story of the financial loss is an important story, but to tell it through the lives and the losses of individuals, I mean, that gains so much more power. And of course, it very crucially, unfortunately, Palestinians, like so many people, in the Middle East, like I know it in the context of Iraq, Palestinians tend to be dehumanized, even when we hear about, the story of loss and victimization, they become, numbers. But what you do with your work is you make it possible for people who might not, I mean, I think probably, all people who attend today who might not really be able to relate, but I think I think academically and politically, your work is really important. And I mean, I guess my obvious question, and I want to open it up, but my obvious question is, so how does your work, if at all, contribute to attempts to bring justice? I mean, is Barclays aware of the kind of work that you do? What are their responses, and what kind of initiatives are taking place? And maybe Karim can speak to that as well, to try to address this very specific aspect of the much larger forms of injustice that Palestinians experience.
Simple answer, nothing. And it's not because Barclays is evil. It's not even Barclays' fault. The problem is who is at fault here. If you think about it, the British government has paid this money, right? 2.65 million to the Israelis. So the British government is not keeping any of this money. The Palestinian bondholders' money, it's paid out, right? Now it's been paid to the Israelis. The Israelis said anybody who can prove the registration of their bonds, right, can come and we'll pay out the bonds. And hundreds and thousands of people who had by this point become Israeli citizens got their money back. The people who got screwed are the Palestinians, and this is why it's central to the story to stress the fact that it happened because they didn't have a state, and so they were not recognized as one of the successors to the mandate. Because as far as the Israelis are concerned, that was the deal with the British government. They said from the beginning, they're not going to be responsible for the Palestinian bondholders. They're going to be paying Israeli citizens, and again, against proof, right? So then the British said, oh, okay, we'll be responsible for the Palestinian bondholders. And those Palestinian bondholders, all they have to do is come and register, and they had redemption centers everywhere. One in Beirut, one in Cairo, one in Amman, even in Cyprus. But this is the problem. The devil is in the details. You can have a registration center. What do you do if you're a victor and you don't have your bonds? You send letters for 8 years, trying to get those bonds. And I'd mentioned there was a story of this woman, Nadia, I know this will maybe interest you. There's this woman, I found a letter written on her behalf by, I guess she got a lawyer. Her name is Miss Abdul Noor Kara, refugee in Jordan. She had 8 Palestinian bearer bonds, 80 pounds, right? And she's writing in 1954. And her lawyer is basically saying, I'm quoting, "My client is a poor woman, and the value of these bonds were all her savings for all her life." And he's right, the lawyer is writing saying those 8 bonds have already been redeemed by somebody who has taken her house. So when you think about, this, even this idea of reparation or making whole these bondholders, how, where? It's been paid, it's done deal. And by the way, the banks in 1954 who were part of the redemption, paying out these bondholders, the banks said, we want an end of claims because we're not going to keep, into 2021, keep paying out these claims. So that was part of the deal that the banks, Ottoman and Barclays, that were involved in paying out the bondholders, that's the deal they did with the British government, that in 1954, we're done with this. So the answer, Nadia, is nothing. And I don't know who would pay this money?
Yeah, well, it's another layer of tragedy that you are, presenting to us. I'm now going to turn to questions and comments from the audience. As I said, you can either use the raise hands function or put your question into the chat function. And we have a question by Ahmed Raza. He's thanking you for your talk. Sreemati, it was great. And the question, the loss of assets due to forced displacement as a result of conflicts seem to have become commonplace now, thinking of Syria, Afghanistan, and so on. Do we have instances based on your knowledge in modern times where people have lost financial assets?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think this is part of, war. I mean, going back to ancient Greek times, there was this concept of, loot being, the spoils of war. I think what's interesting about the Palestinian story is the legalization of this and the whole absentee property mechanisms, the British-Israeli negotiations. So these layers of legitimation, which make it seem different from the loot of ancient times. But I think these kind of property seizures are part and parcel of what it means to be in war. Yeah, there's nothing particularly unique about this. What's unique is the role of all these, the laws. And also what is unique is that, when you think about war going back to the ancient times, it's loot in the sense of you take the houses or whatever, right? Here you're taking somebody's bond, you're taking, and what is a bond? If we step back and think about it, it's the British government that is the debtor in this story, right? The bondholder is the creditor. And that is what I think is unique about this story. That you have a promise to be paid in the future. That's what a bond is. And that evaporates.
Yeah. Right. So questions, comments? Yes, there is a raised hand from Shireen Arazek.
Hi, Professor Mitter and Karim. Thank you so much for this super interesting talk. I was just thinking, it really resonated for me because, in studying Palestinian visual culture, I'm thinking now of Anne-Marie Jasser's film, Salt of the Sea, where a bond reclamation or a bank heist takes place that hadn't really, resonated for me as a super important part of that film. But nonetheless, it's this story of Soraya, who's living in the diaspora and comes back specifically for the reason to claim her grandfather's money back from the British bank. And obviously a moot attempt doesn't happen. And she befriends 2 other Palestinians while she's there in Ramallah, and they hold a bank heist and they steal back the money to the exact dollar amount of, including inflation. And then they flee to go to find her family's home in Jaffa, where, the friends she's made, they don't have the proper ID to be able to actually go to the sea. So there's this sort of fugitivity on 2 different levels. but they go and she has the money, and it doesn't end happily, this story. But nonetheless, it's like a really interesting way, I think, to address the possible, or like the many absences that exist in the sort of archival research that you're doing, for the many stories that can't be traced in papers or documents because of the different like looting and plunder that took place with the establishment of the State of Israel and the mass dispossession of Palestinians. So this is all a long-winded way to ask you, how are you sort of accounting for, to use this term, how are you accounting for the sort of like silences that inherently exist in the stories you're trying to tell? And how does this relate to this story in particular not having been told or being a point of focus, even as it exists in a film that I've seen many years ago and many times, but yeah, that has never really been like a point of focus, I guess, in the stories.
Yeah, so this film, Salt of the Sea, I highly recommend for those of you who haven't watched it to watch it. It's by Anne-Marie Jasser. I actually exchanged emails with her many years ago when I was starting this research. So this thing that I've presented is about the bonds. It's just one chapter of a larger project, which is my book project. And I have 3 chapters actually on the bank accounts. And Anne-Marie Jasser got the inspiration for her film from this man, Michel Karkar, whose bank accounts were frozen, and then he was part of fighting to get it back. And I actually write about the same person in my chapters on bank accounts. I think the bank accounts are very different from the bonds. It's a different story, and I won't complicate it. But Shireen, to answer your question, I think the way to address the archive, there is a total archival absence. That is absolutely clear, in the sense that in the Israeli archives, there's absolutely nothing on these kinds of confiscations. And in the British archives, it's hard to find. But where there are not silences is in the person that you see in your screen. And it's people like Karim, which is why, I can't stress enough how grateful I am that Karim, it was literally a gift from the gods. He was in my Gmail, one day somebody wrote to me. And so for those of you who are on this call or on this Zoom or whatever, and if you know people similar to Karim and you've heard stories, please, reach out to me, because I think these stories they live somewhere. When we talk about archival silences and absences, your words, Shireen, they're silent in an official archive, but they're not silent in somebody's life or in somebody's, traumatic identity formation. They exist. And I think my job as a historian is to be a bit of a detective and to dig them up and to try to put them together and to try to make sense of them. But they exist somewhere. The really sad thing is that this is a generation that's dying, or it's already dead. The Jil Nakba, the generation of the Nakba. So I feel particularly incumbent on myself to just get this out, get the work out into the world as soon as I can, before more people die, before everyone disappears. But the stories exist, the archives exist. They're just not sitting in the British archives or the Israeli archives.
Yeah. Sreemati, we have another question here from Miriam Amri. Thank you for an amazing talk. I'm fascinated by how the language of financial rights and financial subjectivity almost comes into tension with settler colonial ideology. In your archival research, did you find other instances where Palestinians were able to articulate grievances and managed to succeed through mobilizing the language of financial rights and financial subjectivity?
It's a really good question. And I think I alluded to that when I was quoting from Victor's letters, and also this committee of bondholders letters. The language is actually not one of grievance. I will underline how the language is one of loyalty and belief. We're bondholders, it's contractual language, right? The British Empire, the great British Industrial Revolution, is premised on the idea of private property rights. And this is something that, indirectly, they always alluded to. And it's interesting, the Israeli, story is never mentioned. It's not, and I think this is partly to do with the chronology of the story. It's all happening in the very early 50s. Israel at that point is not the Israel of today. Of course, the absentee property laws and the seizure of all the Palestinian bank accounts, this impossibility of redeeming a bond if you're an absentee. All of this is the Israeli story. But the focus, at least in Victor's letters and in the bondholder letters, is really on the British government. And the claim is made to the British government because that's the person who is their debtor. And here I will say, talking about financial grief, it's a great question. Because the British, when they colonized Palestine, their obsession was the Palestinian debtors. But it was the other way around. They were obsessed with helping the Palestinian debtor, the poor Palestinian debtor who doesn't know how to repay debts, who doesn't have the financial sophistication, and we need to modernize him and teach him about the wonders of interest. Well, guess what? The story is totally the opposite, the reverse, right? Here, the debtor is the British Mandate government who essentially has defaulted on paying back the loan. And the creditor is the victor and the bondholders. So this is very clear in the language. It's the language of financial rights as a private property sort of contractual thing, not as a Palestinian refugee, not as a political story, not as, this is about Zionism. It's actually never comes up, at least not in the, materials I've read. And I think that is really interesting. It also shows strategically how they're thinking about, this is where we can strike. It's the British government, right? We bought a bond issued by the British Mandate government, 1944. Well, you have to pay it back. Never mind about Israel, it's not our problem. You did a deal behind everyone's back with the Israelis, that's your problem. You've paid them to 2.65 million pounds. That's your problem, pay us. And I think that is actually very interesting. So it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Bishara, did you want to? Okay.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you very much, Sreemati. It does make a big difference for knowledge production projects to start at the point of the Palestinians themselves if we're going to talk about the Palestinians. Often that's not the case, and especially when it comes to economic history. So we double thank you, not only for doing a kind of a bottom-up story of financial rights, as the previous question mentioned, in financial subjecthood, but to put it in a larger context of the economic history of the mandate, which has never really been told from this perspective. And I think you do have an answer to that question that maybe you're too polite not to, or too humble not to mention, that is, and that is the case of the lawyer Shahadi and his defense of Palestinian bank account holders, not bondholders, and how they ended up winning at the end, if you want to mention something about that here.
I just didn't bring it up because it's a bit of a complicated story. And I will just say very briefly that there's this whole section on bank accounts that I think Sherry, mentioned that this film was about. And if you want to know more about it, read my book when it's out in the world, because there's a lot about it. And I just think I want to separate it from this question of bonds. Because I think bonds are inherently so interesting because of this question of debt. And Bishara's own work is concerns so much the story of debt. And the story is always about the Palestinian debtor. Bishara, I remember you'd said once, I don't know in what setting, you said, debt is the Palestinian story. From, if you're thinking about the economic history of the Palestinians. And what I love about this, well, it's not, love is not the right word. What most enrages me, I think that's the word, about this story, is that the debt is the other way. The bank accounts, I think, are a really important story. I'll just save that for another time, or for the book.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Question by Julia.
Let me invite a question for Karim, because I would like him to have some space here too.
So this is a question by Julia Gatto. Do you think a political ethical refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the new Israeli state factored into Palestinian bondholders' insistence on dealing with the British imperial authorities and financial institutions rather than the Zionist state?
I think it's, yeah, that's probably part of it. Karim, would you like to have a shot at answering that? Perhaps, from at least from Victor's perspective.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I would call it a political ethical refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the new Israeli state, as much as it is logistically even logistically, they wouldn't, given that a lot of the, in the case of Victor, at least, he was in Lebanon, which is an enemy state, like they're in a state of enemyhood, as in it's more of a, from his perspective, he was employed by the British, he owned bonds, sorry, that's work, close it down. He was employed by the British, he owned bonds, British bonds, and that's the, and that's who he will deal with, and that's who he will pursue. I mean, from his perspective, also all his letters were initially directed to Cyprus and then to London. I mean, even logistically from Lebanon, you can't send letters to Israel from day one. So I don't know if I would call it a, I mean, the political refusal is bigger than those individuals, is what I'm trying to say, and them making that decision not to deal with the Israeli state.
Yeah, so maybe just for the last few minutes, you mentioned Sreemati, and we know, of course, that the talk that you gave today is part of your forthcoming book. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about sort of the larger argument and scope of your book.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to do that, because I should have done that during the talk. So as I said, the bonds are just one chapter of a larger book project. And the book project basically is this story, but chapter by chapter, it investigates what happened to different categories of Palestinian assets. So the bank accounts are a very key story, and they're a separate story because, as Bishara alluded to, the bank accounts actually paid out through a very complicated and different sort of mechanism. Then there are these bonds which are never paid out. They're paid out, but to the wrong people. Then there are all sorts of other, assets owned by the Palestinians, such as the pension funds, all sorts of things left over from the mandate, which I'm sort of tracking in a third section of the book. So the book has basically 3 sections, and it makes a very simple argument, which is that these kinds of dispossessions, these dispossession of one's private financial property, can happen easily and have happened easily in this case because the Palestinians were stateless. It is sort of central to my argument because it sort of comes out even in the ways in which these bonds were paid out. Had there been a Palestinian successor state, the British would have been more than happy to say 50% to the Israelis, 50%. This is not, it's not a story of, oh, we hate the Arabs. Quite the contrary, the British were actually quite concerned about the Arab bondholders, but to the extent of their liability. So the vulnerability of a stateless person, and this is not only in the Palestinian case, but particularly in the Palestinian case in this story, the vulnerability of a Palestinian person to losing his or her financial assets, not because of any mysterious reason, but because you just don't have the right to enforce a contract. And all of finance is built on this idea of a contract. I mean, this is basic finance theory. That there's this sentence that you learn when you're taking finance class, right? A well-functioning market presumes the enforceability of contracts, right? I mean, I think I should start my book with that sentence actually, because what this story shows is that financial laws assume that there is a state behind that well-functioning market that can enforce these contracts. And this story shows what happens when you remove the state. And I don't want to go on for too long and we've run out of the time, but I think if I want to leave one thing with you, it is that concept of this whole thing unravels. What's very moving about Victor's story and all these bondholders is these are the very people who in the 40s believed in what a bond stands for. They don't put that, these are not rich people, as I said, these are the salaried professional middle classes, but they don't put their money under the mattress. They don't put it in a hole in the wall. They buy a British mandate government bond, or they have a bank account, or they invest in a pension fund. And this is all based on this idea of a belief in the enforceability of a contract in a well-functioning market. Mm-hmm. And that whole thing just unravels in this story. And the reason why people like Victor never got paid is because there was no one who could make that payment.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps that's where I'll, it's probably as good a place as any to end. And plus we're out of time.
Yes. Well, thanks so much, Sreemati, and thanks again, Karim, for joining us. It was a fascinating, even if devastating talk, and we are certainly very much looking forward to, reading the book. It sounds like this is going to be a very important intervention, long overdue. I'd also like to thank all of you who attended today and joined us. And goodbye, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Karim. We'll be in touch. Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.